My name is David Fletcher. I actually visited the museum, I think the first time probably in the 1960s. But later on they got so fed up with me coming around asking questions, they made me a member of the staff. And what you've seen, or what you're going to see really, is more a collection of vehicles that I feel I'm associated with. There's loads more one could talk about for hours, but half an hour's all we've been allowed.
Please remember to like, subscribe or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can.
I thought just to start off I'd introduce Mr. Kipling, because that's one of the sort of facets of this that some of you may not even know about. It's not the mythical chap who made cakes, forget him. This is a fellow from late 19th, early 20th century who was an author and a poet, and quite a well-known one, who'd lived in India most of his life. He came to Bovington in 1923 to see a friend of his who served here. And while he was here, he noticed a collection of tanks, and he's said to have remarked that they needed a bit of care and attention. And because of that remark, he's credited with having originated the Tank Museum. I don't know that he did, but that's how they like to play it, because he was a famous man and because he was somebody you could latch the place onto. Now, the actual collection of tanks that made up what was in effect the first tank museum dates back to 1919, and it's actually the work, or at least the idea, of a chap called JFC Fuller. Fuller was a staff officer with the Tank Corps and always regarded as rather an influential figure. He was nicknamed Boney because he was very, very good on military history, military tactics and that kind of thing. And he's said to have originally started the Tank Museum, but what they wanted was a collection of tanks representative of the tanks they'd used in the First World War. However, they left it a bit late, and it meant that the collection was mainly assembled from tanks that still existed. There weren't really examples of the earlier models, except of course for Little Willie itself and Mother in a really dilapidated form, and they were the only tanks that really made up the initial collection. Now, Little Willie is really quite a remarkable vehicle. It's preserved here at the Tank Museum and dates theoretically to 1915. It was originally built with the American bullock tracks and later fitted with Tritton's own design of track, which you can see in the images of it. So they decided in a sense to keep it as a historic vehicle. It then moved to Dollis Hill in North London, and it's shown there in a sea of mud, which everything else was, and it's shown there as a historic vehicle. They didn't need it for any other purpose. Then later on came to the Tank Museum, and it is what we show as the very first tank. Whether it really is arguable, but there we are. Another vehicle that was in the original Tank Museum and which has survived, and actually only a very few have survived from that first collection, was the Mark VIII, or otherwise known as the International. It was in the middle of the Tank Museum, down in the fenced-off area at the bottom of the hill, a long way from the present museum, and really a place that was only looked at by Tank Corps officers. For one thing, it was not really a time when people were interested in tanks. They didn't travel at all. They didn't have the facility to travel. If the railway didn't go there, they didn't go, and that was it, because people didn't have cars in those days. They went where the coach or the train took them, and Bovington wasn't on the list. You can understand why. Later on, it became a plinth vehicle out the front of the old museum, or the main building still exists, but really quite an impressive sight. It was on a sloped plinth, looking over the road, and it's the biggest tank that we've got. Now it's inside in the dry, where it ought to be, but that's how it was for many years, outside of a feature of the original tank museum. One of the things we did actually when it was here, to try and save it because it was beginning to rust away, was to have it coated in a substance called fur tan, which meant that it changed colour. It became a light green. It looked horrible. But it's now indoors in the dry, and hopefully won't rust anymore. That's the idea anyway. Now this tank is the Mark V tank. It's a male tank, but it was rather strangely named Diana, which is not a male name normally. Now at the time, when it was a plinth vehicle in the middle of town, in the middle of Bovington, it was ex-4th Battalion Tank Corps, which is why it had a name beginning with D. And that's how it was originally shown. And it's complete, it's a male tank, it's got the unditching beam on top and everything else. And it was there for years and became a landmark. This is how it looked when it was on show in the museum, and it was still running. And they got it out, as you can see, and ran it just for a while to show what it looked like. The trouble was it had been painted up in a very, what they thought was a very authentic camouflage scheme, which wasn't authentic at all, and it was as thick as lino. When we finally cleaned it off, we found underneath all the markings of a tank of H Battalion. We found the actual tank it was, and we now know its full history. But this was part of its story at one time when it was painted in this ghastly shade, and took a lot of cleaning up, but they did it with a needle gun to get it all off and found the original colours and markings underneath. Now this photograph shows a visit by King George V in 1928, and he's being taken round the original tank museum. But there's only two things in sight. One of them is Little Willie itself in the foreground, and just beyond it, it's the Mark V with the sprung tracks. They were two vehicles that survived in the museum, or at least in the original museum. But the Mark V has gone. It was scrapped later. Little Willie survived. In those days, they had to share the original hangar with the School of Tank Technology. But you've got the Independent there, and also one of the mediums, a medium Mark I, that was fitted at one point with a Ricardo diesel engine. That's gone now. That's in the middle there. But that's the original museum. A few tanks were pushed aside, pushed into there at the end of the Second World War, just to give some people the idea of what a tank looked like. But that's how things started off, in a very shambolic way. Here are two exhibits from the original museum. Mother, you can see the white stripe down the side, which was one means of identifying it during the Oldbury trials. But this tank had been converted to a petrol-electric machine in that time. They didn't regard it historically as very important, even though to us it, of course, would be a miracle if it survived now, but it didn't. When it came to the museum in these days, it has no tracks, as you can see. It has no roof. The sun shines in, well, no sun, but the light shines in through the roof. And inside it was a mess. And both the sponsons are gone. And it really does look a strange sight like that, but that was Mother, the original tank, or the original rhomboid tank anyway. Now this tank is a medium D Star. That is a slightly wider version of the medium D, which was used to check its flotation capabilities as much as anything else. It ended up in the museum as well. And although they were scrapped, more in the Second World War to alleviate the need for metal as much as anything else. But they all disappeared then. We haven't got any of them now. We'd like them, of course, but it's too late for that. Two others to show you. The Independent as it is now. The Independent was rebuilt in about 1928, I think. They rebuilt the rear end. They found that it wasn't steering very well, and they rebuilt the rear end to make it steer better, because it was really the reason it didn't steer was because the tracks on the ground were too long. But it was such a big tank, they had to do that. And then they found that with the new rear end, it started to peel apart, a bit like a banana. Every time we went round a corner, the sides came off. And to stop that, they added a new hard axle at the back to hold the back in tight together, and that made it work. In the end, it got so expensive they wouldn't experiment with it anymore, and it came to the Tank Museum.
The Tank Museum is a registered charity, and every purchase you make from our online shop directly supports our work. We ship worldwide, and if you subscribe to our email list, we'll give you 10% off your next order. When you finish this video, go to tankmuseumshop.org and you'll find something you never knew you needed.
In 1951, the School of Tank Technology, which also had its main branch at Chertsey in Surrey, moved down to Bovington. And at the time, it brought with it a load of tanks which had had their day. Many of them were foreign, some of them were British. They were captured tanks we caught in the war, all sorts of stuff. And they came down here and were generally given to the museum. And you'll find many of them still in the collection here now. They're a bit, you can see them you can see the state they're in by the pictures. Sometimes there were two of one and they kept the best one and scrapped the others. At the same time, we had a number of quite important people, important at least in tank corps circles, which isn't much anywhere else, but they were, among others, Captain B.H. Littlehart, who came in 1951. He's the historian of the tanks, and he's shown looking at a board, but it was during a visit at the museum. The other chap is General Sir Gifford Martel. He'd been a lieutenant colonel earlier with the Royal Engineers and had made quite a name for himself. He's inside the Mark V II Star, which was actually sent to us from Christchurch, where it had been a bridge layer. And that's what he's famous for originally, converting tanks into engineer vehicles. And that was one of the things he was a bit renowned for. He came in 1952, I think. Now this will give you some idea of what the Tank Museum looked like in the days before we were charging for admission, when it was free, but particularly when it rained. And you can see from these pictures, the street is lined with cars, and the cars are stacked nose to tail up the side. There's a queue forming outside the museum, and inside there's children everywhere, of course, climbing on the tanks as they were allowed to do, and generally creating the usual mayhem inside. And that's how the museum was on a busy day in the summer in the 1970s. Quite a good crowd, but not really getting much historical fact out of it, or material out of it. That's a view of the whole place taken outside in the 1960s. It shows the three tanks, the old Mark IV on the left, which is now in the Museum of Lincolnshire Life, the Mark VIII in the middle, and the Mark IX on the right, both of which are in the museum here now. Another vehicle that arrived in 1958 was the Hornsby tractor. It actually belonged to the Royal Army Service Corps, but for some reason at the time they didn't want it, and rather than scrap it, they thought they'd give it to us. And it is quite a useful item to have because it goes back to the origins of the track-laying vehicle, which of course the tank became. So it means from that point of view, we can show a vehicle that preceded the tank but used Caterpillar tracks. And there's a picture there of, believe it or not, yours truly driving it. We got it out, started it up, and it still works perfectly, goes rather slowly, and rocks like a mad thing when it's going along by itself. But it is on show in the museum now. You can go and have a look at it whenever you like. Really is quite a historic vehicle. Well over 100 years old now, which is quite something. We also started an agreement with one or two foreign museums, and one of the obvious ones was the Panzer Museum in Germany. They wanted a Panzer IV, And this was one of two that we had, which was donated to them in 1961. You can see the handover ceremony taking place outside the museum. There's a crowd of people there, and also representatives from the German museum. And the tank has been brought out to show what it was like and before it went off to Germany. It means that we've only got the one Panzer IV now, which is historically perhaps more interesting, but that is probably nearer to what people encountered in real life. Now here we have some quite unusual photographs. The Mark I, which had been presented to Lord Salisbury. It was sent to Hatfield and displayed at Hatfield, which is the place where the first tank was demonstrated, and they decided to give it to the Tank Museum, which was jolly nice of them. And the tank had been sitting there for a long time, was very rusty, but we managed to get it pulled down and broken into bits. They took the sponsons off and so on, and they transported it down to Bovington. It's been here ever since about 1970. And lately, or at least presently, it's shown as part of a trench system. And we've got a colour picture of it there in the trench system with the infantry following it. The picture, it's actually a Mark II tank, but it's fitted with the tail of a Mark I. And that's because in the early days at the Tank Museum, not having a Mark I, we had a Mark II done up to look like a Mark I. And that was the best we could do. The tail was removed and put on the Mark I that came from Hatfield, and the Mark II has now been restored to a proper Mark II and is on display in the museum as well. In 1985, we'd become quite an important place. We were charging for admission by this time, and we had a visit from Annika Rice and the treasure hunt team. We were one of the queries on their list of things they had to find, and she posed for one photograph. We had a terrible job keeping the photographer away from her, but she was very entertaining while she was here. Here's another just a bit of excitement, I suppose, in its day. It actually shows a visit by the Russians. What had happened was we did an exchange with the Russian Tank Museum. We gave them a Saracen, an armoured personnel carrier, and a Ferret scout car. And the two together made quite an interesting little ensemble. The Russians, in return, gave us a BTR-60, one of their big eight-wheelers. It's in the background there. It's a backdrop of that photograph. And they gave us a BRDM-1 as well, one of their scout cars. So we got a fair exchange out of it. Both the Russian vehicles were in brilliant condition, in full running order. You'll see, actually, there's quite an interesting lineup. The chap on the fourth from the left is Lieutenant Colonel Forty, who was the curator here at the time. And sitting on the vehicle, I'm afraid, is you'll see two people. One of them, believe it or not, is myself. I'm dressed in Russian uniform, so just to look the part with the vehicle. I didn't normally walk around dressed as a Russian, but on this occasion I did, and that's how it was done. We did that as a handover ceremony out the front. You can see the Russian officers who came with us. They were great fun, I have to admit, even though they only spoke Russian, which was a bit of a handicap because we didn't. But they, apart from the fact that they'd drink vodka like it was water, apart from that, they were terrific fun while they were here. And we went over to Moscow and had a return visit with them. Quite fantastic. This view shows the museum. You're looking outside in the rain. I don't know why we get so much rain here, but it seems to be everywhere the army sets up. They seem to choose places that are soaking wet or hit by howling gales all the time. You never have any sunshine, but still. That shows the tanks, which at the time there wasn't room for in the museum, so they stayed outside. And the nearest two are the Valiant and the A-33, which were experimental vehicles. And there's the M46 in the line up there, and I think on the far end, the Jag Panther. They were all regarded as secondary exhibits, if you like. Not now, they're all major exhibits in the museum itself, but that's how they started out. And that's how the front of the side of the museum looked in those days, with a line-up of these tanks. There they are again. And there's some others there. In fact, there's I think a wooden replica on the end here. That shows the side of the museum, all of which is now covered by the British Steel Hall, but it shows it when the entry block was being built. You can see the roof and the forming in place, but not quite finished, obviously. 1984 was another year when people wanted to come down and poke cameras at us. We took the Mark IV out of the museum and drove it for a BBC feature in the Soldiers series. And it really was quite an experience. We were only allowed to do it in the evening because they wanted to sow explosions in the ground. And since the Queen was visiting Winfrith at the time, they didn't want the explosions to go off while she was there in case she got the wrong idea. So we had to sit around and wait until the evening, which is when we had all these photographs taken. And then we had to run the Mark IV a short way over what looked like a trench. And that's how they filmed it. Again, for some reason, I was elected to drive it. God knows why. I had no more idea about driving a First World War tank than anybody else had, but I figured they thought if it went wrong and I did it, they could all pick on me quite easily. So that's why I'm there. I was the driver. And otherwise, the tank is in pretty well original condition. It was known as Excellent after HMS Excellent, which is the island in Portsmouth Harbour where the Royal Navy has its gunnery school. And then later on still, in 1984, it was presented to the Tank Museum and was fully restored and got into running order. And I think it is still in running order now, although we don't run it today for obvious reasons. It doesn't do them any good, but just for a while it was quite a vehicle to have going. And it was a real honour to learn how to drive it. This aerial view was taken by a chap in a helicopter. He couldn't fly by himself, he had to have a helicopter. And it shows the museum in the new state with the various buildings, the British Steel Hall on the right, the new First World War Hall on the far end, and the Tamir Hall at this end. It was just to give us more space, and it meant that we could bring a lot of tanks in from outside. We'd had a number of different curators, obviously, at this time. When I first came to the museum in the 1960s, it was Brigadier Alan Brown was the curator. He was replaced by General Nigel Duncan, who was the man who commanded the flails in Normandy during the war. And he was a marvellous chap. And he worked there until he retired. He was replaced by Colonel Peter Horden, who'd been with 5th Royal Tanks in Italy. And he ran it for a long, long time, actually. And he was replaced in turn by Lieutenant Colonel George Forty. And when George retired, he was replaced by Richard Smith, the present incumbent. And that's how it's gone, in fact, in my memory anyway. I don't know who was here before Alan Brown, but at one time, the curator of the museum was also the director of the Royal Tank Corps schools. So he had two jobs, and this was really run as a sideshow. Now it's a big business, making a lot of money, and it requires full-time attention from a lot of people as well. This picture was taken in 1991, and it shows two of the tanks from the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, being brought into Bovington. They're on civilian low loaders. I think the one on the right looks like the up-armoured T-55, and the one on the left looks like a T-72. I don't know if it is or not. T-62 maybe. But they came down here and they swelled our ranks quite considerably. In fact, we had a a Gulf War exhibition in the British Steel Hall at one time. That's all gone now, but the tanks are still here and they're just scattered throughout the collection. And it does give us a chance to show a slightly more up-to-date Soviet collection. We can't go right up to date until they give us one, which they haven't done for a long time, but never mind. This was an interesting tank. It's an early Churchill. It's actually shown as a Mark I with a gun sticking out the front. It's in fact a Mark II. It's now in the museum and clearly visible as a Mark II. The thing was, it had had a most interesting history. It had become bogged down when it was used on exercise in Yorkshire. Later on, it was pulled out of there by modern vehicles and taken to the Museum of Army Transport at Beverley, where it was on show. It spent some time at Beverley before Beverley itself folded, so the tank was sent down here, and it gave us a marvellous example of an early Churchill. Well, that really takes us to the museum as I knew it. And I'm talking only about the time until I retired, which was now quite a few years ago, actually. And we've only shown you that side of things. I can't honestly guarantee to have gone back to 1919. I didn't, but we've put that in just to show you how it started and to give you some idea of how the museum has developed since then. So I hope you've got something out of that. Thanks very much indeed.